Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Friendly Circle Berlin Monday workshop. My name is Patrick, and I'm going to be your host. And today, it's my great pleasure to introduce you all to Piers Kaniuka. Piers has, I came across Piers on his amazing, wonderful YouTube channel, which I enjoy very much. I think I've listened to all of his recordings on there, his interviews. That's Resistance Recovery. And we'll put information about Piers in the chat during the meeting. And we're going to take a wider view of addiction and recovery today with Piers. So I'll start off, Piers, just by asking you a little bit about yourself. And maybe we'll do it in the way we do it in the 12-step rooms, what I was like bit to start with. And could you tell us, what brought you into recovery in the first place? What was going on in your life back then?
Well, my journey to recovery is probably, first of all, I want to say hi to everybody, and I'm intensely curious about who you all are and where you're from. So if I could, I'd be interrogating you and not the other way around. I came into recovery like most of you did. I had a long run with drugs and alcohol that culminated in the 1990s with a heroin addiction in Seattle. And I am what they would call treatment resistant. So I went through a lot of treatment, few detoxes, a methadone program, and nothing works. And then I finally did manage to get sober for 8 months, which was the longest I'd ever been sober, but it was harrowing. I went to meetings, I went to aftercare, I went to counseling, but I just was not getting better. And it was then that I met somebody that a lot of you know. I had the great fortune of meeting Don Pritz, and that's when my recovery journey really began, my 12-step journey.
All right. Now, I've heard a lot about Don Pritz, and we had a little chat earlier because we had Don Koyas on here.
Oh, great.
But yeah, we had Don about three or 4 years ago. We had Don. It's on our YouTube channel, The 4 Seasons of Recovery. And Don mentioned his early sponsor was Don Pritz. And I'd like to ask you a little about Don Pritz. Now, you were mentioning to me that he took you partially through the steps?
He took me through the first 3 steps, and I had an experience with that I know other people in the 12-step world have a comparable experience, but it was particularly powerful for me and changed everything. It was just remarkable. So it was a weekend. It was a big book workshop that Don did these for about 5 years, almost every weekend for 5 years. And people would fly him around America and beyond, and he would take you through steps 1 through 3, starting with the title page and finishing with third step. And it was just remarkable. You know, the thing about Don that's very hard to convey is that he was so totally unassuming. This was a truly modest human being, and he had no stake in the game financially. He was being flown around because he was being asked to, and he was such a calming presence that I felt after the weekend that if I could just have him around me, I would be okay. So it was remarkable, and I've never met anyone before or since like Don Pritz.
Yeah, I've heard that he's literally sponsored thousands of people.
He did, and in the States, his lineage is just, the sponsorship lineage just flows everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly done a lot of flowing into the white, Don Koyas has done incredible work with, I mentioned Don Koyas just for the people here who may not have come across Don and his work. Don Coyes is the founder of White Bison and the Wellbriety movement, and the Red Road to Recovery, where he's brought a different form of recovery. Would you talk a little bit about, because I think you know quite a bit about Don's work in White Bison and
Don
Wellbriety.
Coyes?
Yeah.
Yeah, Don had trouble. He's a big book guy, and he had solid 12-step recovery, but it kind of broke his heart that he couldn't find his way to his own people. So he would bring the 12 steps to Native American populations, and they would shrug it off and say it was white man's medicine. And then he had this sort of pivotal experience. In a lot of Native American peoples, there are prophecies around a white bison or a white buffalo. And I believe it was 1994, a white buffalo, which is very, very rare, albino buffalo, was born in Wisconsin. And many Native Americans showed up and did ritual and ceremony around this. And Don was there, Don Coyes, and he had a vision. And the vision it involved a tree growing from a sapling to fully grown, and then the wood of the tree forming a circle. And then he somehow knew in the vision that on the circle were 100 eagle feathers. And he was not someone who was prone to this kind of thing, visions. And so he was very, very, very troubled by this. And eventually he went to some elders. I'm pretty sure he went to Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, these are the poorest counties in the United States where alcoholism is just rampant. But they also have a disproportionate influence on Native American spirituality today. So there's a lot of very powerful teachings and leaders that come out of this community. And so he brought his vision to them. And when he tells the story, it's just hilarious because he would speak and then he would stop speaking. And he was standing in a circle of grizzled old men who were, I hope I'm getting this story right because there's a bit of a game of telephone going on here, but they made him very, very nervous. And so he continued speaking. Then eventually they told him that 12-step medicine that they told him about was very, very powerful, but it needed to be recontextualized for the native peoples. And that is what White Bison is. It takes traditional teachings and gives the 12 steps a new context. And very, very powerful. And it has done tremendous work on the lands of the indigenous people, but also in prisons. There are programs for youth. There are programs for Al-Anon. It's really powerful, and it gets quite a bit of participation from non-native peoples. So.
Yeah, I've checked out some of their online meetings. I mean, I just had a wonderful time when Don came to visit with us, and his talk is on our YouTube channel. You'll find it there. It's called The Four Seasons of Recovery. Because Don has that way of looking at recovery not as a linear path, but as a circular path, and it's really a beautiful way to look at things, and it makes a lot of sense. And his deal. I think there've been because he does talk a great deal about the 12 steps and continues with the 12 steps, but he brought that trauma piece. Obviously, the trauma suffered
Yes.
in the native communities is beyond belief, and so I found listening to him quite ahead of his time, really.
He's really ahead of his time, and a lot of credit goes to his one of his partners, who's a non-alcoholic, half Native American man named Eduardo Duran, who's a psychologist with a Jungian background, who helped him with a lot of this, and his expertise is in multi-generational trauma. So one of the teachings of White Bison is that they have to learn to forgive the unforgivable. And when you think about the power behind that, the kind of spiritual, juice one would need to do such a thing, it's really quite remarkable.
Absolutely. And I also understand the recovery rates that he mentioned are higher now with integrating that piece
Oh,
than they
I
were
don't
just
doubt that at all.
under
Yeah.
straight 12 step on
Okay.
the, in their communities. And yeah, he talked about Don being an early sponsor, and then he was introduced to his Native American sponsor in AA called Johnny Looking Cloud.
Uh,
And that's when everything changed, when he was fourth year in recovery and he was going through depression, and Johnny said, "You're absolutely in the right place. This is
mhm,
what's happening. The trauma is coming up."
mhm.
Um, you know, I think we could move on now to Bruce Alexander, because he's another one that I learned about, and then I had found that you had brought him on for conversations and even some live conversations. I think at a rehab that you were involved in, and Bruce, what he talked about is that prior to colonialization, they didn't have those issues in the Native American community. Those addiction issues. Would you talk a little bit about Bruce and his work?
Yeah, well, just by way of getting there, I don't know when it was. I can't. 2007 or eight. I actually went to a training with White Bison to become it. And then they called it a fire starter. And it was then that the facilitator, this wonderful man named Woody, took me aside and he said, prior to European colonization, we did not have alcohol and drug problems in Native America. And I was, you know, quite taken aback by that and the implications of that. He also, for the record, said that until the Indian boarding schools, there was very little child molestation in their communities, and that what they believe is that many of the children got abused at the schools and brought it back to the lands. But so years later, I would run across the work of Bruce Alexander, specifically a book called The Globalization of Addiction, which is a really thick, heavily footnoted tome. Might not be the best place to start with Bruce. I would recommend going to brucekalexander.com and reading some articles. But in it, he basically says the same thing. He says that intact indigenous cultures do not suffer from addiction, and that even amongst the European cultures, what you see is the further back you go into antiquity, the more you see what we would call alcoholism being something confined to the elite, with the exception of a couple of places, namely Russia. But he says he looks at things like the Scottish Highlanders, who were notorious for what they called riotous drunkenness. The Braveheart folks, and he said, but these accounts don't look like alcoholism. They look like very, very heavy drinking to celebrate victory in combat, birth, death, marriage. But the alcohol consumption did not have the effect of destroying the social fabric. And so Bruce's definition of addiction, I think, is the best one that I know of. That goes any overwhelming involvement with a substance or an activity that has a deleterious effect on you or your social relations. So if you break that down, what he's saying is um, overwhelming involvement means the time, money, and energy you put into said substance or activity comes at the expense of your family, friends, and community. Now, the beautiful thing about this is he includes uh, activities. So it could be shopping, it could be your cell phone, it could be gambling. But he says it's addiction if it starts destroying the social fabric. The implications of this are profound because really, he calls this dislocation, by the way, psychosocial dislocation is what's causing addiction. And he points out that in the US today, we're, by whatever measure we have, we're the most addicted society in the history of the world. So when you combine that with there having been cultures where addiction was relatively unknown, Now we're in a place where we can really explore what they call the etiology or the causes of addiction. Um, huge seismic change in our understanding of addiction. But sadly, his research does not find its way into the academic world. It does to a degree in sociology and anthropology departments, but rarely do you find it in the psychology departments where it really should be taught.
Yeah, well, that's a great shame. I mean, I know that you talked about bringing dislocation theory into the treatment setting because you do work in the treatment setting, and could you tell us a little bit about how that would work in practice?
Well, I don't know if people are familiar, but I use a model of addiction that comes out of the big book. And basically, there's a physical component, which is addicts lose control once they start. Neuroscience is increasingly confirming this, that we structural changes to the brain from the abuse of drugs and alcohol. Then there's a mental component, which is the obsession to drink that becomes, really powerful when we're sober and it's irrational. And the big book promises us that we can be recovered from that, psychic change. But the third dimension is the emotional dimension. And sometimes we just call this RID for the line in the doctor's opinion, which is restless, irritable, and discontent. And Bruce and I talked about this model at length, and we came to an agreement that what we call the emotional component of addiction, which is the thing that's there first for most of us in becoming addicts. Like there's a story in the big book that there's a very typical AA story that goes, I'm paraphrasing, but it all started when I was 12 years old and we raided Dad's liquor cabinet. And I remember I got really high and I got sick and I got in trouble. And then there's a line that reads, and I could not wait to do it again. And that is so telling because when you think about it, that's not normal. And that means that child, that teenager, found the solution to a problem that he didn't know he had. And that's my experience. That when I started smoking pot at 11, I found a solution to a problem I didn't know I had. So the addiction itself is rooted in that emotional piece. And the beautiful thing about the 12 steps is that's really what it treats in steps 4 through 9 or 10, the emotional piece. But Bruce and I, after our conversation went on for a while, we started looking at the idea that really what AA calls RID is really psychosocial dislocation. And I think there's a lot to that, and that's something that we could run with more research.
Yeah, and I guess Bruce, people might have heard of the Rat Park experiment.
Yes.
Maybe you can tell us, for those who haven't heard about it, that was how I first heard about Bruce. Was I know what's this Rat Park experiment? Maybe you could explain that.
Well, his claim to fame initially, he was a young man. He might have still been a graduate student, but those of you in the audience have often seen in like Psych 101 textbooks for college, you'll have a picture of a black and white photo of a rat in a cage, and there's a dispenser of liquid morphine and a dispenser of water. And the rat invariably comes to prefer the liquid morphine to food and everything else. And Bruce was a young man. Now, a couple things about Bruce is he's an agnostic and he's not an alcoholic, but he's a very humane, sharp guy, modest guy. And he was looking at this experiment and he saw it was basically bias confirmation, meaning that they designed the experiment to prove what they already believed, namely that morphine is overwhelmingly addictive. So he decided to test this. He also said you're torturing the rat. The rat's alone. Initially, is probably terrified, then it's bored. There's nothing to do. And so he creates this rat park, which is this big cage. I wish I could tell you the dimensions, but there was plenty of like places for rats to hide, treadmills and tunnels and nutritious rat food and other rats that they could, play with, have sex with even. And then they would hang the liquid morphine in the water, and the rats really confirmed what Bruce suspected would happen. They preferred the water. They didn't go to the morphine. And he did say there were a few rats that did continue to drink the morphine, but he even called them partier rats. He says because none of them really got addicted. They would go over and hit the morphine, and then they would go, play with the rats again. Um, he introduced addicted rats into that environment, and they stopped drinking the morphine. This was, and this made it in all the journals. And then the results of that study, well, the study itself just languished on the shelves for decades. It was like forgotten until the opioid epidemic, and then people started looking at it again. So, but in the meanwhile, that study is what eventually gave birth to Bruce's dislocation theory.
Yeah, the other thing, that we're getting at here is this idea that there's really a cultural issue at its root, and then we have this medicalized model, and the what do you call it, the disease model,
Yes.
where it's looked upon as, oh, it's just a disease, and now neuroscience, and it's synapses are going wrong in your brain. It's just like a brain disease.
Mm-hmm.
Narrows it down, right? I mean, what do you think about the disease model, which has found its way into the treatment setting? I know most treatment centers now that, well, for good reason, sometimes you need Librium to, get people off the DTs and all of that. But the idea of over medicalization and this disease model, obviously, what Bruce is saying flies in the face of all of that, would you say?
Oh, yeah. Bruce doesn't believe it's a disease. And the thing about the neuroscience, it cuts both ways because if you look at a book like The Biology of Desire, which I can't recommend enough, even though I don't agree with all of it, by Mark Lewis, Lewis shows the structural changes in the brain. In fact, what he really shows in the book, which is fascinating, is why cognitive behavioral therapy can't work with an addicted brain. But Lewis says it's not a disease. Lewis says that this is what addictive behavior is what human beings turn to soothe themselves in the face of overwhelming stress and trauma. And America may not export many products anymore, but we do produce our share of trauma and stress. So, uh, by Mark Lewis, Bruce Alexander, Gabor Mate, Carl Hart, a very fine thinker named Kent Dunnington, who's a theologian and philosopher. These are all prominent, cutting edge thinkers in this field, and none of them believe it's a disease. Disorder, yes. Public health problem, yes. In fact, in Lewis's book, he says, he points out that it wasn't officially a disease in the States until 1953. And that had less to do with science than with the belief that calling it a disease would reduce stigma and open up funding.
Mm.
But, here we are. So by calling it a disease, and at least here in the States, means that the medical industrial complex gets to dominate the field of recovery if it is paid for by insurance, whether public or private. And that has created a lot of problems. So basically, what we're seeing is the marginalization of abstinence-based recovery. When I'm not saying it's the only game in town, but I'm saying it shouldn't be marginalized. It should have its place at the table, and a prominent one at that. So it's a really it's a sad state of affairs because I think that we have gotten to the point where we understand what it takes to get better from addiction, especially the research into trauma, the research into attachment theory, things like depth psychology, the legacy of the 12 steps. There's certainly a huge body of people that if researchers were serious, they could study us and why we got better and try to operationalize that. But, we have a model in America, and this isn't just, psychiatry. This is just American medicine, which is basically medicate as many people as you can for on as many meds for as long as possible. I mean, that I know that's pretty brutal, but that's pretty much the model. And here you'll see things like a person has type 2 diabetes, and they could do something about it with diet and exercise, or they can keep their unhealthy lifestyle and take the medication. So it's pretty epic, really, to face it every day in one's work, especially.
Yeah, well, this is why I think the sort of work that the lens that you're bringing to it is so important, you know. But like you said, I mean, I don't know that an insurance company will cover depth psychology after rehab or
No,
the study of dislocation theory. But
no,
meds, yes.
meds, yes. They won't cover yoga most of the time,
They don't,
inpatient.
they don't, sorry, they don't cover yoga?
Not usually. And
Right.
yoga's got so many, dissertations behind it for its beneficial effects for all number of, all kinds
Yeah.
of things.
Yeah.
So,
What about mindfulness or probably?
well, what a lot of people do, and this is one of the strategies, is a lot of people will get licensed as clinicians, and that will enable them to get jobs in these places. And then they will introduce some of these alternative modalities that way. So there are ways to work through it. Um, but you're always, it's always has to be a sort of subversive action. Yeah. Most places work like this. Remember, I talked about the body thing. Well, the body thing, what they do is they fudge the distinction between sobriety and recovery. And basically, if your presenting problem is you empty a fifth bottle a day, then all they try to do is extinguish that behavior, right? And that's success. So, as we know, as 12 steppers, sobriety is not the goal, it's actually the beginning of the journey. And then for the mental symptom, they spend a lot of energy on that with triggers and relapse prevention, cognitive behavioral model, which I think is very ineffective. And then for the emotional symptom, where really the problems are, that's where the medication comes in. That's where they make their money. That's where Big Pharma has captured this industry in the United States.
I don't know if you've seen it yet, but there's a new documentary called Shuffle that
Yeah,
I have you seen it?
I have I've refused to watch it because I know too much about it firsthand, and it would just it'd be
Yeah,
more of the same.
it's hard to watch. I mean, I went to a premiere of it, and the guy who made it was there. You know, he's in recovery, but I mean, the exposure of the this crazy stuff going on in the rehab industry in Florida, California, high-end rehabs, just ripping people off. But anyway, that's another matter. But
It's a
I know
big
there are
part of
some
it.
great rehabs. We had on here. We had a panel discussion with representative from High Watch,
Uh-huh.
and High Watch, was the first 12-step rehab in America.
Hmm.
Bill Wilson, Marty Mann was on the board. Bill
Yeah.
and Lois were early visitors and involved, and they've just had all their clinicians trained in internal family systems.
Yeah, I've heard about that. That's fantastic. And IFS is so great because it speaks to this, this being rooted in the emotional, but also it dovetails really beautifully with the Jungian world. So it's got a tremendous potential.
So how do you then bring in this work to people when they're at the rehab you're involved in, and you're bringing them into these ideas? What do they do after rehab if it's
Well,
not?
you,
Yeah.
you mean beyond the usual kind of aftercare referral system and sober living?
Yeah, I'm thinking, of what I'm seeing. I'm seeing more groups like ours set up, which I think is great. I'm seeing I'm on a whole bunch of WhatsApp groups, and I'm seeing them starting every day, these recovery meetings, just people in recovery starting meetings of how to integrate 12 steps with IFS, how to polyvagal theory. And these are all people in recovery. Just this is where it's coming from. It's coming from the periphery. It's not a top down. It's coming in from the all sides, bottom up.
Well, that really heartens me to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, I keep I curate a Facebook page called Resistance Recovery where we post a lot of this stuff. It's about, I welcome anybody in the audience to join. It's about 2,500 strong, and a lot of articles get posted, and it's a bit of a community. That has always been my hope. What you just described, my hope is that a ground up organic movement would start, or movements would start, and these
Mm.
conversations. I mean, to me, I think we live in a time where conversation has actually become subversive, meaning to read Bruce Alexander's book with a group of people and, tease out the implications of it and what it means in terms of your own addiction and recovery. That's actually a pretty radical thing to do in a digital culture, especially. So, I'm a Pied Piper of this stuff, and I have a pretty broad network, but I don't have anything like Friendly Circle Berlin, that's for sure.
Well, we'll make sure that people know where to find you. The Facebook page. What is it? Resistance Recovery on Facebook.
Yes, yes.
All right, there you go, folks. There it is. Somebody put it in the chat. So, yeah, I mean, I do see it happening. I think this is one of the upsides of what came out of the pandemic, to be honest with you, because suddenly everybody went online, and then people from outlying areas suddenly were able to get all of this information. I know with our group, it just took off. We started right when the pandemic hit. And now I see, and which really heartens me to see, there's probably somebody here today who'll start that book study of Bruce Alexander's book. There's a lot of people here who are doing stuff. And there's tons of book studies online of all kinds of books. Gabor Mate's books, the IFS books, the polyvagal theory books, you name it, all to do with recovery.
There's some fantastic stuff out there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll
So it
give a
seems,
shout out if anybody's theologically inclined. I got to give a shout out to a book called Addiction and Virtue by Kent Dunnington. It is just a remarkable piece of work. And basically, what he says in there, he's got a background in what's called virtue theory, which is Aquinas. But he basically says that the idea that addiction is either a choice or a disease is a false binary, and that if he had to make a choice, he'd go with disease every time, as I would. But he resurrects this older notion, a philosophical idea of habit. And what he means by habit is he doesn't mean biting your fingernails. He doesn't mean habits that can be easily extinguished if you've got enough motivation. He means habits that provide what he calls moral goods. And a moral good would be like alcohol provides me freedom from loneliness. Cigarette smoking provides me punctuation in my day, reward for a job well done. And he says those habits in quotation marks. It's the moral good. These are all philosophical terms that make them so hard to give up. And I think that's, in fact, I did an interview where I introduced Dunnington to Alexander, and it was fantastic where they kind of teased all this out.
yeah, that is a great interview. It's on resistance recovery, folks. Kent Dunnington and Bruce Alexander with Piers as a wonderful host.
It
So
was a lot of fun.
yeah, it seemed like you were having a good time. I saw you taking notes all through it. So, so this brings us then, in the big book, it says that we have a spiritual malady, and it says something like once we straighten out spiritually, once the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically, and obviously we're coming from all sorts of backgrounds, both spiritually leaning, even religious leaning, and then secular leaning. I noticed the growth of secular AA is phenomenal. And And I know that this has been a major area of your life. Would you like to talk about what brought you this idea of the spiritual malady, and maybe how we can approach, there's another discussion that I hear about spiritual bypass.
Oh yeah.
Just turn it all over and everything will be fine and you don't have to worry about, and I get it from people, good friends of mine who are kind of fundamentalist AA guys. I'm very much part of AA. They'll say you're just confusing people with all this stuff. They just need to go to meetings and find God.
Guilty as charged. Well, one thing about me is I've been in the big book, like in a very granular kind of way for 31 years. And I think the spiritual malady is on the bottom of page 44. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. And if we unpack that, basically a code of morals, knowing the difference between right and wrong, the voice inside of me that tells me right from wrong, my conscience. So you could change the sentence to say, if having a healthy conscience was enough to overcome alcoholism, I would have already gotten better. And so the spiritual malady for me is I have a healthy conscience, but I always go against it. And so when I get sober, I have a very bad conscience because now I can't evade I can't drink away all those stunts I've pulled. But what really got me when I got in recovery is I thought that I did bad things because I was an alcoholic. And when I got sober, a whole other monster showed up where I was extremely short tempered. I still lied. I could not. I treated women poorly. I got in relationships with women I didn't like because I was using them, and I could not stop these behaviors. So my spiritual malady is that I can't live according to my conscience sober, and I can't live according to my conscience using. And then the next paragraph in the book says, lack of power. That's our dilemma. It doesn't say we have to find a power by which we can stay sober. It says we have to find a power by which we could live. So that's an admission that my problems, drinking is just a symptom of my problem. If you take the booze away, now we're getting down to where the real problem is. And that's my understanding of the spiritual malady. But I think what's happened is, life is a lot different than it was when the big book was written. And in many ways, I think Bill Wilson had it much easier than we do, given how cheap drugs are, how the middle class has been gutted, how the social fabric has just been rent. So Bill would get somebody back in the day, or Bob, and they could assume the guy was probably married. He probably left his door unlocked. He didn't have to chaperone his kids. Blood family, relatives lived in the neighborhood. Church, synagogue, the American Legion. They're all this social fabric that you kind of return the alcoholic to. I have many clients that don't have any social fabric to return them to. And so I think that's part of why we've become so attuned to trauma, because we just see it all the time. And we're realizing that, unless this gets addressed, a lot of these people are just going to be returned to, these environments that are going to re-traumatize them. So I think the spiritual bypassing, like if you look at it, you're working with somebody who's newly sober and everything is about vaping and eating and flirting with the girl, and they're always trying to take the edge off of how they feel because they don't feel good. They're suffering. It makes sense. They need relief. But sometimes what they do is they graduate to other and the vaping and the eating and all that is only provides transient relief. Ironically, much like liquor does, but liquor does its job better. But a lot of people will turn to healthier things like yoga, like a lot of somatic therapies, things that are essentially really good and important in recovery, but they're still providing just transient relief. No one's ever getting under the hood to really deal with what's causing the addiction. And that's where I think the 12 steps are actually, in my less than humble opinion, are actually really, really important because they take us under the hood. They take us down into the causes of this condition. And it's very painful and very hard work. And you need to be held and loved. And you need to have somebody who is really competent to help you, which is not always easy to find. So I think spiritual bypassing these days, it becomes the retreat to Aruba. It becomes psychedelic psychotherapy. It becomes spending a small fortune on, various somatic modalities. And once again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those things, but until we get under the hood, we're kind of trapped in this treadmill of seeking relief 5 minutes from now. As Don would say, I know I'm better when I'm okay right here, right now. And that's it's a real indication of whether somebody is healing from their recovery if they're comfortable in their own skin in the present.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you came across Chogyam Trungpa. He wrote a great book called Spiritual Materialism.
Yes, yes, great stuff.
The
Yeah,
spiritual industrial complex is alive and well.
yep, that's right. It gets monetized.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the beauty of the 12 steps. I mean, I can say, well, it was circumstantial, but I did not pay a dime for my recovery. I was indigent, so a Catholic hospital had to take me free. I went to live with my parents. I went to meetings. And then I heard about Don Pritz, and for the price of a bus ticket, I all this happened. And it should be that way for more people. If we really built out these communities the way you're talking about it, it could be that way for more people, or minimal cost anyway.
Yeah, that's what we're really working on. We found out the hard way, we're trying to put on conferences. It costs a lot. So we're trying to do it a little bit more cost effective by bringing it all online than doing another live conference this year. But it was great to, meet people in person at a live conference. There's still something very special about that. So now you're talking about getting underneath the hood, depth recovery, and of course we had Corey Gamberg, your colleague and friend, on here talking about the Jungian work that he does, and I think I heard you describe the fourth step as a form of shadow work.
Yeah.
Maybe you could, maybe we could talk about, maybe in the setting that you're in, do you bring those concepts into people in recovery in your rehab doing their fourth step?
Yeah, wherever I work, we bring in under the title of psychoeducation. We bring in Jung, we bring in Bruce Alexander, we bring in White Bison, we bring in all these things. Um, and we never, ever, ever have a group on triggers and relapse prevention. That's a deal breaker for me. I won't work any place where they do that. So, when Jung talks about fairy tales and myths, it's always the descent into the underworld. And that's what he imagined shadow work to be. And so when you are writing a fourth step, you are going into the underworld where all the psychic monsters and boogeymen live. But if you look at like the myth of Persephone or something, when she was forced to marry Hades, she discovered something about the underworld and about Hades, the Lord of Death. She discovered that he was very, very wealthy and not a pretty nice guy too. And so the image here is that realm where all the monsters are, where all the demons live, is also the realm of the riches. And so if we're going to get better, we have to make that a similar descent. So I think the fourth step is part of that. Really, if you want to reimagine 12-step recovery in terms of depth recovery, you could say really it starts when you're lying in bed with insomnia and your conscience is haunting you. To me, that's the beginning of the spiritual journey. That's when prayer it's really important because that's when you're confronting the truth and that you're under the hood. It's just a matter of, we're conditioned to when we're in that kind of pain to run to the relief, to the spiritual bypass or the vaping and the sandwich or whatever, rather than, being taken into that realm.
Well, I just think that's we did start a shadow work group that was very active while we were going through Cody Peterson's book, The
Uh-huh.
Archetype of the Alcoholic. And that was, people really got a lot out of that. And I'd like to do more of that. Hopefully, Corey's going to come back and take us into the underworld.
Yeah. Well, that is his. He
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
he is the psychopomp of the underworld.
Yes, yeah, no, and he just did a presentation at the Young Institute, and you collaborate, right, with the Young Institute in Boston?
We do. We've had the good fortune of having two interns from there, and the one we have right now, Vinny N. Give him a little shout. He has been in recovery, I believe, for 46 years or something. He's a 70-year-old man who, in his retirement, uh, Jungian analysis was a big part of his recovery. So he decided to get the diploma from the Jung Institute, and he had to intern somewhere. So we got him. It's been fantastic. Yeah.
Wonderful stuff. I know we want to get along to questions. I'm just trying to see if there's something else I want to cover with you here. There's another area that you're involved with, because you talked a bit about, we have to do this ourselves. It has to be people in recovery actually doing this ongoing work, because we're not going to get paid for anything by insurance companies to bring it in. Or the rehabs are not going to be compensated for doing that after rehab. And I know that your collaboration work, I think, is great in that respect with the Young Institute. And then the Alcyon Center, maybe you could tell us about the Alcyon Center, because I think a lot of your graduates end up going to programs there, and you do
Yeah.
some programs there, I see.
Yeah. So the Alcyon Center is a remarkable place. It's located on Mount Desert Island in Maine, which is where Acadia National Park is. It's a contemplative retreat. And when I got into the steps, I went to seminary and studied. I got a degree in theological studies, and so I was on fire with my step experience, and really my step experience informed my studies more than theology informed my step experience. But anyway, I met a woman there named Catherine Booth, and she and I became famous friends, very unlikely friends. She's one of my dearest friends, and she and her partner Jim Grant started a retreat center called the Alcyon Center. There was a piece of land in the family. This cost of this land would be prohibitive now. And basically, both of them were trying to escape parish ministry. The church is, the mainline church in America is in steep decline and has been for a long time. And they start this recovery center, not a recovery center, contemplative retreat. And all the people they were trying to escape from were showing up at the retreat and they were losing their minds. And I said to them, I said, "Oh, I could fill this place up. I'll just bring the addicts here." And they were like, "Really?" And the next thing you know, the majority of people going here, well, 50% anyway, maybe higher, were people in recovery. And so we engage in all these spiritual practices. We do some certificate programs. But what's so fantastic is you've got a lot of really good people who come from worlds that are not really touched by addiction. A lot of them are, high-end psychotherapists and clergy and retired educators and things like that, meeting with people that are, you know, newly sober, been incarcerated, have really been through the grind. And what's so amazing, especially to Joan and Catherine, but also some of the other folks, is just how precocious the drug addicts are. Meaning, they ask theological questions that are like so deep and so profound that it makes the other people's jaws drop. and also the fact that they can speak so candidly about their suffering and what they've been exposed to. It's been a real adventure, and I intend to spend my my retirement up there more and more. It's a great place, beautiful place.
Yeah, I'm dying to visit. I saw that you've got some workshops that you're putting on there later in the year.
Yeah, we've got a series of recovery workshops. Place is also very influenced by anthroposophy and the work of Rudolf Steiner. So it's a pretty remarkable place.
Wow, that's a whole nother world. The work of Rudolf Steiner. That's a whole nother discussion we'll have to have.
I'd
I'm a
like
big
to.
fan of Rudolf Steiner, and
Well, one of the things we're teaching up there is basically the 12 steps in light of anthroposophy. That's a program
wow,
this coming year. Yeah.
wow, I love it.